What you feel before a major decision isn't fear, it is biological prudence. Your brain possesses a constant scanning mechanism that cannot distinguish between a predator in the wild and a sales presentation that might go wrong. For your biology, social risk and physical death use the exact same electrical wiring. Most people spend their entire lives trying to accelerate a car with the handbrake still engaged. They assume the problem is fuel, more motivation, more discipline, more effort. The problem is mechanical. In the next several minutes, I'm not going to give you encouragement. I'm going to show you the mechanism, where it came from, how it works, and why your intelligence, the very thing you trust most, has probably been the system's most reliable tool. There's a silent pattern destroying the most promising careers I've ever seen. If you walk into any elite organization right now, you'll notice something disturbing. The highest producer is not the most intelligent person in the room. They aren't the one with the most degrees or the most natural talent. In fact, the most qualified person in the room is statistically the one underperforming the most. This sounds like a management failure, but it is a biological fatality. Today, I'm going to show you why your brain has concluded that your success is in fact a threat to your survival, and why the more capable you become, the more dangerous your potential appears to your own DNA. We've been taught that failure is a character flaw, that if you freeze, it's because you lack courage or the right mindset. This is a convenient lie, but a dangerous one. What you feel before a major decision isn't fear, it is biological prudence. Your brain possesses a constant scanning mechanism that cannot distinguish between a predator in the wild and a sales presentation that might go wrong. For your biology, social risk and physical death use the exact same electrical wiring. But here is the part no one tells you. This system activates with more intensity in the most capable individuals. Why? Because competence creates stakes. If you are mediocre, you have nothing to prove. If you are brilliant, every move puts your identity on the line. Your brain isn't trying to sabotage you, it is trying to protect you from a social death it believes is real. The problem is that you're trying to solve a neurological problem with motivational slogans. It's like trying to fix corrupted software by shouting at the monitor. To move forward, you don't need to feel better, you need to understand the architecture of the trap. That is not a motivational problem, that is a neurological one. And it requires a very different kind of answer. The story most people carry about fear of failure goes something like this. Some people are naturally confident. They were raised in the right environment, given the right encouragement, and arrived in adulthood with a solid foundation of self-belief. When they encounter a challenge, they move toward it. When they fail, they recover quickly and try again. Other people, for no fault of their own, did not receive that foundation. They grew up in environments that punished mistakes or withheld approval, and they absorbed the message that failure is dangerous. That fear became part of their personality, and now as adults, it holds them back. This story feels compassionate. It acknowledges real differences in upbringing. It removes some of the moral weight from the person who struggles, and it points toward a reasonable solution. If the problem is low self-belief, then the answer is to build confidence, visualize success, accumulate small wins, surround yourself with people who believe in you. Eventually, the fear subsides and the action follows. Most self-improvement content is built entirely on this framework, and it contains something true. Childhood environment matters enormously. Early experiences do shape patterns that persist into adulthood. The research on adverse childhood experiences and long-term behavioral outcomes is substantial and serious. But the framework is incomplete in a way that makes it quietly harmful, because it locates the problem in the person's character rather than in their biology. It treats fear of failure as a flaw, something to be overcome through discipline, mindset, and the right kind of self-talk. And when that approach does not produce lasting results, the person concludes that they simply have not worked hard enough on themselves. They commit to more visualization, more journaling, more motivational content, and the pattern continues unchanged. There is a reason this framework is so persistent. It offers the person struggling with it a complete and internally consistent explanation for their experience. You are afraid because of what happened to you. The solution is to heal that and build new self-belief. The path is clear, the destination is defined, it is a coherent story, and coherent stories are difficult to abandon even when they are not producing results. But coherence and accuracy are not the same thing. What most people have never been told is that fear of failure is not primarily a character issue, it is a design feature. It is the predictable output of a system that is functioning exactly as it was built to function. The person who freezes before a high-stakes presentation is not weak. They are experiencing the activation of one of the most powerful protective mechanisms in all of biology. Understanding that distinction changes everything about how you approach the problem. You cannot negotiate with a character flaw by being harder on yourself, but you can work with a biological mechanism once you understand what it is actually doing and why. The structure of the brain was not designed in one moment. It was assembled across hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary pressure, layer by layer, each new structure built on top of what came before. Deep inside that structure sits the amygdala, a small, almond-shaped cluster of neurons whose primary function is threat detection. It scans incoming information continuously. It evaluates stimuli before the conscious mind has fully processed them. And when it identifies something that resembles a threat, it initiates a cascade of physiological responses designed to keep you alive. Heart rate increases, cortisol and adrenaline flood the system. Attention narrows. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning, analysis, and rational decision-making, loses priority in the signal hierarchy. Resources are redirected from thinking to reacting. This is the fight-or-flight response. It is extraordinarily effective for the situations it evolved to handle. The problem is classification. The amygdala classifies threats based on pattern recognition. It does not analyze the actual danger level of a situation with any sophistication. It compares incoming information against past stored patterns of threat experiences and makes a rapid judgment. And because the modern environment is so radically different from the one this system was built for, the classification is frequently wrong. Most people never realize this. A critical performance review activates the same alarm system as a physical confrontation. A public speaking engagement registers similarly to exposure in an open environment with no escape route. The prospect of launching a business that might fail, and fail publicly in front of people whose opinion matters to you, produces neurological activity that the brain processes as a survival-level threat. This is not metaphor. The physiological response is the same. The hormonal cascade is the same. The measurable effect on rational cognition is the same. Imagine someone who spent 3 years developing a consulting methodology. They built the framework carefully. They tested the concepts in small, controlled settings. They wrote detailed documentation and gathered case studies. Every time someone asked when they were going to launch publicly, they had a reasonable answer. It was not quite ready yet. There was one more case study to complete, one more element of the model to refine. Then a website issue arose that needed addressing first. Then a market shift seemed to warrant revisiting the positioning. 3 years. The product was technically ready after 18 months. From the outside, this looks like perfectionism. From the inside, it feels like responsibility, like the appropriate diligence that someone serious about quality should exercise. But something specific is happening beneath both of those interpretations. Every time the launch becomes concrete, every time an actual date appears on a calendar and a real audience becomes tangible, the threat detection system activates. The imaginary audience becomes a real one. Real audiences can judge. Real judgment can confirm the fear. And the person's intelligence, the very capability that makes their methodology valuable, immediately generates a list of legitimate, well-reasoned justifications for continued delay. The reasoning is genuine, the concerns are often real, but the engine producing them is not discernment, it is protection. The brain does not announce that it is afraid, it produces reasoning, credible, intelligent, well-constructed reasoning that justifies the next pause. Research from the National Institute of Mental Health has consistently documented this pattern. Each successful avoidance episode strengthens the neural pathway that produced it. The brain registers the avoidance as a successful threat response. The threat was real, the avoidance worked.
Next time the same stimulus appears, the avoidance response activates faster and with greater intensity. There's another layer to this that is even more difficult to see from the inside. The avoidance does not stay contained to the original trigger. Over time, it generalizes. The person who avoids public failure in one professional context begins to develop sensitivity to any situation that shares structural similarities: high stakes, uncertain outcome, visible result, judgment by others. The nervous system builds a map of dangerous territory, and as that map grows more detailed, the range of actions that feel genuinely available begins to quietly narrow. This is the hidden pattern. Avoidance is self-reinforcing. Every time someone retreats from a high-stakes action, the system becomes more sensitive to that category of threat, not less. The feared outcome does not need to actually occur for the fear to grow. The act of avoiding is sufficient to teach the brain that the fear was justified. Over years, this produces a person who appears, to themselves and to others, to be exceptionally careful and thorough,
who always has a considered reason why this particular moment is not quite right, who is perpetually approaching readiness without quite arriving there, and who cannot understand, despite all the preparation invested, why the gap between where they are and where they intend to be refuses to close. There are two mechanisms that sustain the pattern once it takes hold. Understanding them separately makes the whole structure visible in a way that vague awareness of fear cannot. The first is what behavioral scientists call the amplification effect of avoidance. When a difficult situation is postponed, it does not stay the same size in the mind. It grows. Not because anything about the actual situation changes, but because repeated avoidance sends a continuous signal to the threat detection system. This thing is serious enough to avoid again and again. Each avoidance confirms the danger rating. Each day of postponement adds weight to the internal representation of what is being avoided. Think about a person who needs to have a difficult conversation with a business partner. The conversation would take 45 minutes. It involves a real disagreement about the direction of the company, not a crisis, but a necessary confrontation that both parties know is coming. On Monday, they decide it is not the right moment. There is a deadline this week. Better to wait until things settle. On Thursday, things are calmer, but the partner seems stressed. It would be unkind to add to their burden right now. The following week, the relationship has cooled slightly. There is a new tension in their interactions. The conversation that would have been uncomfortable but manageable in 45 minutes has now, after 2 weeks of amplification, become an event of enormous psychological weight. The actual information that needed to be exchanged has not changed, but through the mechanism of postponement alone, it has been transformed into something that feels genuinely threatening to approach. And this is where things become interesting. The person is not imagining the difficulty. The conversation really has become harder. Avoidance created the reality it was trying to escape. Research from behavioral science programs at Stanford has documented what happens neurologically during sustained avoidance. The prefrontal cortex, the reasoning brain, progressively disengages from the feared stimulus over time. The emotional brain takes over more fully with each avoidance episode. By the time the person finally faces the situation, they are doing so with a neurological profile closer to a threat response than a rational problem-solving session. The window for clear thinking has narrowed precisely because of the delay intended to create better conditions for clear thinking. The second mechanism is comparison as a scarcity signal. Human beings are social creatures who evolved in small group environments where relative status had direct implications for survival. Being perceived as low status in a tribal context was not merely uncomfortable, it had real consequences for access to resources, protection, and the basic conditions of life. The brain has not updated this calculus for modern environments. When someone observes a peer who appears to be further ahead, more successful, more recognized, more financially secure, the threat detection system does not interpret this as neutral information to be evaluated dispassionately. It interprets it as a status gap, and status gaps in the ancestral environment were genuinely dangerous signals.
The result is that comparison does not produce clean motivation. It produces a scarcity signal. The internal message is not, "They are ahead, I can learn from what they did." The internal message is, "I am behind, I am losing, there is not enough, I may not make it." Imagine someone in their mid-30s who has built a solid marketing consultancy. Revenue has grown steadily over 4 years, reaching about $180,000 annually. The business is objectively doing well by any reasonable measure. Then they attend an industry event and encounter a former colleague, someone they remember as less technically skilled, less precise, less thorough, who is now running a larger operation, commanding fees nearly double their own, speaking on panels and building a public reputation in the field. They return from that event with what feels like renewed motivation. They work longer hours for 2 weeks. They redesign their service offerings. They begin drafting a new market positioning strategy with genuine energy. And then, quietly, the energy dissipates. The strategy document sits unfinished in a folder. The original rhythm of the business resumes unchanged. What happened is not a motivation problem. It is a threat response that burned itself out. The comparison activated a scarcity signal that produced short-term physiological arousal, which felt from the inside like drive and urgency, but the underlying neurological state was threat, not opportunity. And threat responses are not designed to be sustained. They are designed to produce a burst of protective action and then subside. They are not fuel. They are emergency systems, and you cannot build a career on emergency responses.
The University of Copenhagen documented this pattern in research on social comparison behavior. Individuals who engage in frequent upward comparison experience significantly elevated anxiety and reduced capacity for sustained strategic action, not because the comparison reveals actual deficiencies in their situation, but because the brain is processing a perceived status gap as a threat to survival. Pay close attention to what happens next. The person who understands this mechanism stops experiencing comparison as information about their own value or trajectory. They start experiencing it as a neurological event, predictable, temporary, and entirely separable from any honest assessment of their actual situation. That separation is not a small shift in perspective. It changes the entire relationship between what you observe in the world and how effectively you can respond to it. There is a quality that appears consistently in people who operate at sustained high performance over years and decades. It is often misread as natural confidence or an easygoing temperament or the accumulated effect of repeated success building on itself. It is none of those things. What it actually is, a different relationship with a threat signal. These individuals are not less afraid than everyone else. They do not have fundamentally quieter amygdalae or more tolerant nervous systems. When they face a genuinely high-stakes situation, a major decision with real consequences, a public performance that could fail visibly, a confrontation with significant relational risk, the same biological mechanisms activate. Cortisol rises, attention narrows, the body prepares. The difference is entirely in the interpretation. Most people experience the activation of the threat response and interpret it as a signal to stop, or at minimum to wait until the feeling passes. The physical sensation of anxiety before a significant action feels, to the nervous system, indistinguishable from a genuine warning, and the reasonable response to a warning is caution. People who perform at consistently high levels have, through a combination of accumulated experience and deliberate perspective work, developed a different interpretation of that same physical signal. The elevated heart rate before something important is not read as danger, it is read as preparation. The narrowing of attention is not experienced as the onset of paralysis, it is experienced as the sharpening of focus. This is not a semantic trick. It is a genuine neurological distinction that produces measurable behavioral differences over time. The activation, the hesitation, the identical physiological event, and 2 completely different lives built from it. Research on high-performance athletes, surgeons, and emergency first responders has shown that the physiological profile of elite performers under acute stress is nearly identical to the profile of someone experiencing significant anxiety.
The difference is not in the body's response, it is in the cognitive label the person applies to that bodily state. One interpretation produces approach behavior, the other produces avoidance. Once you understand this, many things start to make sense. It explains why certain people seem to improve under pressure while others deteriorate under the same conditions. It explains why years of experience alone do not eliminate performance anxiety, because without a shift in interpretation, more experience simply means more episodes of successfully treating the signal as a warning and responding with caution. The experience confirms the fear rather than dissolving it. It also explains something that surprises most people when they first observe it directly. The person who has been performing at high levels for many years is not more relaxed about high-stakes situations. They're often more sensitive to them, more aware of what can go wrong, more capable of imagining the specific ways that things might not work. The threat detection system has, over years, become more sophisticated, not quieter. What changed for them is not the volume of the alarm, it is the response the alarm triggers. It also explains the behavioral gap that develops over time between people of similar underlying capability. The person operating from a threat framework will, over the course of years, unconsciously organize their professional life to reduce exposure to high-stakes situations. They will move toward roles with more control and less visibility. They will prefer projects with well-defined parameters over ambiguous ones with higher potential. They will deepen expertise in areas where they are already established, rather than entering adjacent spaces where they are unknown and therefore vulnerable. Each of these choices is individually defensible. Each one can be framed as prudent strategy or appropriate focus. Together, they produce a career that has been quietly shaped by the avoidance architecture rather than by what the person actually intended to build. Contrast this with the person who has reinterpreted the signal. Their behavioral choices, aggregated over the same period of time, tend to include more first attempts, more visibility before they felt fully ready, more exposure to situations where failure was genuinely possible and publicly observable.
Not because they were reckless, but because the feedback loop was different. The same signal that slowed one person down accelerated the other. And here is what matters most about this. The activation framework is not a personality trait that some people are born with and others are not. It is a learned pattern constructed through specific experiences, specific interpretations, and the accumulation of specific evidence, which means it can be deliberately built by anyone who understands what is actually being constructed. There are 3 shifts in perspective that change the relationship between a person and the mechanisms this video has described. They're not techniques to be applied. They are ways of seeing the same reality differently. And once the shift genuinely occurs, the behavioral change tends to follow without requiring sustained force of will. The first shift is treating failure as the delivery mechanism for intelligence that success cannot provide. Consider what a successful outcome actually tells you about your own process. It tells you that what you did worked under these specific conditions with this particular configuration of variables at this moment. That is useful, but it does not tell you which elements of your approach were essential and which were incidental. It does not reveal the weakest points in your method. It does not show you what would break under different pressure, because nothing broke. Failure tells you all of that. When something does not work, the precise location of the breakdown becomes visible. The assumptions that were wrong surface. The elements that were underprepared reveal themselves. A person who treats failure as data rather than verdict has access to a quality of intelligence about their own process that someone with an unbroken record of success simply cannot accumulate. This is the part that most people get completely wrong. They apply the concept sentimentally, reassuring themselves that failure is okay, that it is part of the process, that everyone experiences it. The sentiment produces a kind of emotional permission to try, but without the analytical follow-through, sitting with what happened, documenting what it revealed specifically, updating the system based on what was learned, the failure produces only the cost without the return.
The idea that failure is data only generates value when the data is actually extracted and used. The second shift is understanding that confidence is not a precondition for action, it is a consequence of it. Most people are waiting to feel ready. They are completing one more preparation phase, acquiring one more credential, refining the approach one more time. The implicit belief is that at some threshold of preparation, the confidence will materialize. Then the action can begin safely. This sequence does not produce what it promises, not because preparation is worthless, it is not, but because the nervous system does not generate confidence from information alone. It generates confidence from experience, from the specific embodied record of having attempted the thing and survived whatever resulted. Research from the University of Melbourne on repeated action and self-belief found that behavioral engagement increases genuine confidence at a rate significantly higher than cognitive preparation or positive self-reflection alone. You do not think your way into capability in unfamiliar territory. You accumulate repetitions. The first attempt will be imperfect, so will the 5th and the 15th. This is not a problem to be eliminated before beginning. It is the condition under which the nervous system actually learns that the situation is survivable. By the 50th attempt, the body has 50 stored instances of engaging with this category of challenge and continuing forward. The threat classification begins to shift, not because the challenge became easier, but because the evidence base changed. There is a specific threshold that researchers in behavioral psychology have identified, somewhere around the 30th to 50th repetition of a genuinely uncomfortable, high-stakes action. The neurological profile of the person performing it begins to change measurably. The prefrontal cortex engages more fully. The amygdala activity during that category of situation decreases. The person does not feel fearless, but the fear no longer occupies the same amount of cognitive space. There is room for analysis alongside the discomfort, room for strategy alongside the alarm. That threshold cannot be reached by reading about it. It cannot be reached by believing it is true. It can only be reached by accumulating the repetitions. Think about your own situation. Whatever the action is that you have been preparing to take, the evidence base cannot exist until the attempts begin. Every additional day of preparation before the first attempt is a day in which no new evidence is introduced. The fear stays at its current level because nothing has changed happened. The third shift is anchoring identity in trajectory rather than in the result of any single moment. A business that is 8 months old has had exactly 8 months to develop. A skill being built has accumulated exactly as many repetitions as have actually occurred. A career path is a direction, not a destination where your value can be confirmed or invalidated at a particular checkpoint. When identity is located in the direction and quality of movement rather than in any current position, the single difficult day becomes what it actually is, one data point in a long sequence. It does not revise the capability, it does not determine the destination. It is noted, analyzed for what it reveals, and incorporated into the next attempt. The moment you locate your sense of self in the direction you are moving, rather than in where you currently stand, the stakes of any individual failure change completely. They become proportionate, manageable, informative rather than defining. At some point, it becomes worth asking a question that is mildly uncomfortable to sit with honestly. Not what fear of failure has cost you in terms of external outcomes, the projects not launched, the conversations avoided, the opportunities that passed. That accounting's real and worth doing, but it remains external. It is a ledger of results. The more important question is what it has cost you in terms of who you became while managing it. Think about your own ceiling. Not the ceiling you can see clearly, the obvious constraints of time, capital, or access, the one that operates below the level of conscious reasoning, the one that appears as a sensation, not quite a full thought, that this particular project is not quite ready, that this particular moment is not quite right, that the foundation needs to be a little more solid before you can move forward. That sensation is not a reliable signal about the quality of your work. It is the threat detection system doing what it was designed to do. It is functioning correctly. It is simply not calibrated to the life you are actually living. And here is the part that requires the most honesty.
The system has been using your own intelligence against you. Every sophisticated reason for not moving yet, every well-constructed argument for waiting until the conditions improve, is the output of a mind that is genuinely capable of building that argument, and that is, at the same time, genuinely afraid. The quality of the reasoning does not tell you whether the fear is driving it. In fact, the higher the quality of the reasoning, the harder it is to see. Most people spend their entire careers responding to that signal as if it were objective information about external conditions. They adjust the external variables in response, new strategy, new skills, new environment, and the ceiling follows them, because the ceiling was never about the external variables. Seeing that clearly is not comfortable, but it is useful, because what can be seen can be questioned, and what can be questioned can be changed. Return for a moment to the observation that opened this video. The most intelligent, most prepared, most capable person in the room frequently produces less than someone with demonstrably fewer apparent advantages. That pattern seems, at first encounter, like a kind of injustice, evidence that effort and capability are not reliably rewarded, that the wrong people get the outcomes. But that reading misses the actual explanation entirely. The person with fewer apparent advantages often has a simpler relationship with the threat signal, not a better character, not superior willpower or emotional resilience, not a more supportive upbringing or a more fortunate set of circumstances, a simpler interpretation of the internal alarm, one that has not yet accumulated the decades of reinforcement that transforms ordinary caution into load-bearing architecture. When the signal activates, they move through it. Not because they are fearless, but because the fear has not yet learned to speak in the vocabulary of their specific intelligence. The highly capable person has, through years of applying real intellectual rigor to self-protection, built a structure so internally coherent that it no longer presents itself as avoidance. It presents itself as standards, as appropriate discernment, as the measured care that someone with genuine expertise owes to their work before releasing it into the world. This is the mechanism at its most sophisticated. It has recruited the person's greatest strength, their capacity for rigorous analysis, and redirected it toward the task of justifying stillness. And it does this so convincingly that the person experiences the output as wisdom rather than as fear. Wisdom and fear can produce identical behavior. The difference is only visible from the inside, only to someone who has been willing to look honestly at what is actually driving the reasoning. Once you see that clearly, much of human behavior becomes easier to understand without judgment. Why organizations frequently promote the confident over the competent. Why certain approaches generate momentum not because of their technical quality, but because they moved when others were still preparing. Why the market often rewards the person who went first over the person who was most ready. None of that reflects a fair distribution of capability. It reflects whose protective system permitted movement and whose did not. The brain was not designed to help you succeed in the life you are actually trying to build. It was designed to keep you alive in an environment that no longer exists. And for most of human history, those two objectives pointed in the same direction. They no longer do. The actions most likely to produce meaningful results in the world you inhabit, visible risk, public exposure, the real possibility of consequential and observable failure, are precisely the actions the threat system was constructed to prevent. This is not a character failure. It is a design mismatch between a very old system and a very new set of conditions. The work is not to eliminate the fear. Fearlessness is neither achievable nor, honestly, desirable. The threat system exists for reasons that remain real. The work is to develop enough clarity about the mechanism itself that you can make a distinction in a given moment between a signal pointing at genuine danger and a signal pointing at the boundary of your current evidence base. Those two experiences feel identical from the inside. The body cannot tell them apart on its own. The sensation in the chest is the same. The voice that generates reasons for caution sounds the same, whether it is protecting you from something real or protecting the architecture of avoidance you have spent years constructing. But the mind, given sufficient understanding of what is actually producing the signal, can begin to develop that capacity for distinction. Not perfectly, not immediately, but incrementally through the same mechanism that built the avoidance pattern in the first place: repetition, evidence, and the gradual updating of what the nervous system believes is true about what you are capable of surviving. And in that distinction, quiet and often unremarkable in the moment it first occurs, the ceiling is not removed, but it is no longer invisible. What you could not see could not be questioned. What you could not question could not be examined. And what could not be examined was never actually a limit of your capability. It was only the edge of what you had been permitted to believe about yourself.